Chapter 19. The collapse of the Ecumene did not happen all at once. Even in its final years, the Forerunner civilization remained unimaginably vast. Entire sectors continued functioning long after others had fallen silent. Fleets still fought desperate defensive campaigns. Builder facilities continued producing weapons and supplies. Life workers continued preserving species wherever they could. To many citizens living far from the front lines, daily life still retained fragments of normality. Yet beneath that appearance, the foundations of civilization were failing. The flood was everywhere. No longer confined to distant regions, the parasite now threatened the very heart of Forerunner space. Systems that had stood secure for millions of years suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Communication routes vanished. Trade networks collapsed. Refugee populations overwhelmed every available sanctuary. Entire worlds disappeared from contact and were never heard from again. The Ecumene had spent ages believing itself eternal. Now it was discovering that eternity can end. The Didact continued fighting for as long as possible. By this stage of the war, he had become something more than a military commander. To many warrior servants, he represented the last embodiment of traditional Forerunner strength. He remained committed to resistance, even as circumstances deteriorated around him. Every available resource was directed towards slowing the flood's advance. Every remaining fleet was thrown into battles that grew more desperate with each passing year. Yet even the Didact could not see the truth. Military victory was no longer possible. The flood's intelligence had grown beyond anything the Forerunners anticipated. Graveminds coordinated campaigns across enormous distances. Entire offenses unfolded with terrifying precision. The parasite anticipated strategies before they were implemented. Defensive positions that should have been held for decades sometimes collapsed in weeks. The enemy had become too powerful. The realization forced a final break between competing visions for the future. The Didact still sought ways to preserve civilization. Builder leadership increasingly focused on ensuring that something survived after civilization ended. Those are not the same objective. History often treats Halo Array as though it were a weapon chosen by consensus. The reality was considerably far more complicated. Many Forerunners opposed it. Others supported it only reluctantly. Some never fully accepted the idea at all. The Didact remained among the strongest critics. His objections were understandable. The Halo Array represented an admission of failure. More than that, it represented a violation of everything the mantle was supposed to protect. The Forerunners had claimed stewardship over life for millions of years. Now they were preparing to extinguish that life on a galactic scale. To the Didact, the contradiction was unbearable. To others, it was unavoidable. The librarian occupied perhaps the most painful position of all. No one had dedicated more effort towards preserving life. No one had spent more years cataloging species, protecting ecosystems, and preparing for the future. Yet she increasingly recognized that the future she hoped to preserve might only exist if the array was activated. This realization haunted her final years. The conservation measure expanded to unprecedented levels. Species were gathered from every corner of the galaxy. Genetic archives grew larger. Preservation facilities filled with samples representing millions of years of evolutionary history. Entire populations were quietly relocated to secure locations beyond the reach of the coming catastrophe. The librarian could not save the present. She devoted herself to saving the future. Meanwhile, events surrounding the Didact took a tragic turn. The details are complex and spread across several sources within Halo lore, but the broad outcome is clear. The Didact's increasingly extreme efforts to combat the flood brought him into a conflict with other Forerunner leaders. His Promethean experiments remained controversial. His frustration with political leadership deepened. Relationships that once anchored him began to fracture under the pressure of endless war. Eventually, he was removed from the center of events. The librarian herself played a role in this outcome. It remains one of the most emotionally complicated moments in the Forerunner saga. The two still cared deeply for one another, yet they had reached fundamentally different conclusions regarding the future. The librarian believed the galaxy's survival required preparations beyond the Didact's vision. The Didact believed surrendering to the Halo Array represented a betrayal of everything worth defending. Neither was entirely wrong, but neither was entirely right. History would leave both carrying impossible burdens. As these personal conflicts unfolded, the Flood continued advancing. The final years of the Ecumene became a blur of retreats, evacuations, and desperate holding actions. Worlds that had survived for millions of years vanished beneath Flood assaults. Fleets were sacrificed to buy weeks rather than victories. Entire sectors were abandoned because there were no longer enough resources to defend them. For the first time since the rise of their civilization, the Forerunners were truly losing control. Then came the fall of the capital. The Flood's attack on the heart of Forerunner civilization shattered any remaining illusions. If the capital could be threatened, nowhere was safe. If the center of the Ecumene could fall, the Ecumene itself was already finished. Panic and despair spread. Yet, so did determination. The final phase of the Halo Plan moved forward with renewed urgency. The rings were completed. The Ark became the center of preparations. Preservation efforts accelerated. Every remaining resource was directed toward one objective: ensuring that something remained after the end. One of the most remarkable aspects of this period is that many Forerunners understood exactly what was about to happen. They were not ignorant participants stumbling towards disaster. They knew the Array would kill them. They knew their civilization would not survive. They knew millions of years of history were coming to an end. And still they continued. Not because they wanted to, because they saw no alternative. The final decision fell largely to one individual, the Isodidact. Born stellar makes eternal lasting. He had inherited responsibilities beyond anything he could have imagined when his story began. Through circumstances unique to the Forerunner saga, he became the figure entrusted with carrying the final burden of the Ecumene. The galaxy around him was dying. Flood-controlled regions continued expanding. Communication networks failed. Entire species stood on the brink of extinction. Every available report pointed toward the same conclusion. There was no more time. The moment had arrived. After millions of years of civilization, after the rise and fall of empires, after the betrayal of the Precursors, the human Forerunner War, the corruption of mendicant bias, and the Flood's conquest of the stars, the fate of the galaxy came down to a single choice: activate the Array, or allow the Flood to consume everything. The decision was made. Across the galaxy, the Halo rings fired. Their effect was instantaneous. Every sentient being within range died. The Flood's food source vanished. Civilizations disappeared. Species disappeared. The greatest empire in galactic history disappeared. The Forerunners had saved the galaxy. The cost was the galaxy itself. For a brief moment, silence spread across the stars. The Flood was defeated. The Ecumene was gone. The age of the Forerunners had ended. Yet the story of Halo was far from over. Because hidden safely beyond the destruction were the seeds of a new beginning. The librarian's preserved species remained. Humanity remained. The Ark remained. And in the quiet aftermath of extinction, a new chapter of galactic history was about to begin. The age of inheritance had begun. Chapter 20. When the Halo Array fired, the Flood lost. The Forerunners lost as well. That distinction is important because later generations often remember the activation of the array as a victory. In military terms, it was. The flood's expansion was halted. The parasite was denied the sentient life it required to sustain itself. The grave mines died. The vast intelligence that had threatened to consume the galaxy was shattered. Yet victory usually implies survival. The Forerunners did not survive. Not as a civilization, not as an empire, not as the masters of the galaxy they had spent millions of years building. The Ecumene was gone. The worlds remained, the stars remained, countless structures remained, but the civilization that had connected them had all vanished in a single moment. Silence settled across the galaxy. For the first time in millions of years, there were no great powers, no interstellar governments, no galactic economy, no fleets crossing the stars. Entire sectors of space became graveyards filled with abandoned worlds and empty cities. Magnificent Forerunner structures continued functioning exactly as they had been designed, but there was no one left to appreciate them. The galaxy had not been merely wounded, it had been reset. The responsibility for rebuilding now fell to those who survived. The Ark became the center of that effort. Located beyond the reach of the array's pulse, the Ark endured, while the rest of the galaxy was swept clean of sentient life. Preservation facilities remained intact. Genetic archives survived. Life workers continued carrying out the final stages of the conservation measure. The plans developed by the librarian over centuries suddenly became the foundation upon which the future depended. Without them, life would have ended. With them, life could begin again. The process was unimaginably complex. Species preserved during the war had to be returned to appropriate worlds. Ecosystems needed restoration. Populations had to be carefully reintroduced. Entire planets required monitoring to ensure that life developed successfully. The effort represented one of the largest biological restoration projects ever undertaken. Fortunately, the librarian had anticipated the challenge. Long before the array fired, she had spent years preparing for this exact possibility. Every preserved species carried records identifying its origin. Every ecosystem had been studied extensively. Every detail that might help rebuild the galaxy had been cataloged. Now those preparations paid off. Across countless worlds, life returned. Plants were replanted. Animals were released. Entire populations emerged from preservation facilities and stepped onto worlds that had once belonged to their ancestors. Many had no memory of the civilizations that had came before them. Many would never learn the full truth. That was partly intentional. The surviving Forerunners understood that the mistakes of the past should not necessarily be inherited alongside its achievements. Among the species received special attention was humanity. The librarian's interest in humanity had never disappeared, even after the Human Forerunner War, even after humanity's defeat, even after the firing of the Halo Array itself. She continued believing that humanity possessed an important role in the future. Her actions during these final years remain among the most significant in all of Halo history. Throughout the Forerunner saga, the librarian repeatedly speaks about humanity's potential. Not humanity as it existed during the ancient wars, not humanity as a military power, humanity as a successor. This idea traces all the way back to the Precursors. Millions of years earlier, the Precursors had chosen humanity rather than the Forerunners as inheritors of the mantle. The decision had triggered the chain of events that eventually led to the downfall of both civilizations. Yet even after everything that followed, the librarian never completely abandoned the possibility that the Precursors had seen something worth preserving. As humanity was returned to its home world and surrounding regions, additional preparations were made. Genetic instructions were embedded within future generations. Latent tendencies were preserved. Potential pathways were established. These Gias, as they would be later known, were not commands. They did not dictate behavior. Instead, they acted more like seeds planted within the future. Under the right circumstances, They could influence discoveries, decisions, and developments thousands of generations later. The librarian could not control the future. She could only guide it. That guidance would eventually touch figures like Dr. Halsey, Master Chief, and others connected to humanity's later destiny. At the time, however, such individuals lay 100,000 years in the future. The galaxy had much rebuilding to do first. The surviving Forerunners faced difficult questions of their own. For millions of years, they had ruled the stars. They had claimed stewardship over life itself. Their authority had shaped the development of entire civilizations. Now they found themselves standing among the ruins of everything they had built. Some believed the Forerunners should begin rebuilding their empire. Others strongly disagreed. In the end, the latter perspective prevailed. The surviving Forerunners concluded that their age had ended. This decision remains one of the most remarkable acts in Halo history. Few civilizations willingly surrender power. Fewer still do so after holding it for millions of years. Yet many survivors came to believe that the Forerunners had failed in their responsibilities. The destruction of the Precursors, the rise of the Flood, and the firing of the Halo Array all pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The mantle had not been upheld. The Forerunners had broken it. Rather than reclaim their former dominance, they chose exile. Groups of survivors departed known space entirely. Some traveled beyond the galaxy. Others vanished into regions that remain mysterious even in modern Halo lore. Their exact fates remain uncertain. What is clear is that they never returned. The age of the Forerunners was over. The galaxy belonged to those who came after. For thousands of years, life slowly reestablished itself. Species spread across familiar worlds. New cultures emerged. Ancient memories faded into myth. Ruins that once belonged to the greatest civilization in history became mysterious relics scattered across the stars. Humanity, meanwhile, began again. Not as an empire, not as a galactic power, not as the civilization that had once fought the Flood and challenged the Ecumene. As hunter-gatherers, as farmers, as tribes and kingdoms. The descendants of ancient humanity inherited no memory of the wars that had shaped the galaxy. They looked up at the stars without realizing their ancestors had once ruled among them. They built civilizations without knowing that countless others had risen and fallen before them. This was the future the librarian had chosen. A second chance, a clean beginning. Yet despite all her preparations, one problem remained unsolved. The Flood was not truly gone. It had been defeated, it had been starved, it had been contained, but samples still existed, hidden away within secure facilities, stored for study, preserved by Forerunner design. The logic behind the decision was understandable. The Flood represented one of the greatest mysteries in galactic history. Destroying every sample might mean losing knowledge forever. The Forerunners believed containment systems would endure indefinitely. History would eventually prove otherwise. The Flood slept. The Halo Rings waited. The Ark continued its silent work. And across a forgotten world called Earth, humanity began walking a path that would eventually lead back to the stars. The next age of Halo's history was beginning. It would be slower than the last, smaller in scale, but every bit as important. Because from these humble beginnings would emerge the civilizations that players encountered in the games themselves. Chapter 21. For the Forerunners, the story was over. For everyone else, it was just the beginning. The activation of the Halo Array marked one of the clearest dividing lines in galactic history. Everything before it belonged to an age of giants. The Precursors, the Forerunners, ancient humanity, the Flood War, and the Ecumene all existed on scales almost impossible for later civilizations to comprehend. Entire species rose and fell across spans of time measured in millions of years. Technologies existed that could reshape worlds and manipulate stars. Civilizations governed vast portions of the galaxy. That age ended with the firing of the array. The age that followed was very different. For thousands of years, the galaxy remained quiet. Not empty, not dead, but quiet. Life returned gradually to countless worlds. Species re-established themselves within ecosystems carefully restored through the librarian's conservation measure. Entire populations adapted to environments that had once belonged to their distant ancestors. New civilizations emerged without any knowledge of the events that had preceded them. This was exactly as intended. The surviving Forerunners did not want younger species growing beneath the shadow of their empire. They did not want every civilization shaped by ancient grievances and forgotten wars. The purpose of the conservation measure was not merely to preserve life, it was to give life another chance. Most species never learned that they had received one. Earth serves as a perfect example. Humanity's homeworld had survived the destruction of the ancient age, but very little remained of its former glory. The vast interstellar civilization that once fought the flood and challenged the Ecumene was gone. The technologies of ancient humanity vanished. Its cities disappeared. Its fleets became dust. What remained were people. People who would eventually become the ancestors of every human civilization that followed. They hunted, they farmed, they built villages and cities. Kingdoms rose and fell. Languages formed and evolved. Thousands of years passed, then tens of thousands. Ancient humanity faded so completely into myth that even the idea of an earlier galactic civilization became unimaginable. The irony is one of Halo's most fascinating themes. Modern humanity views itself as a younger species struggling to earn its place among the stars. In reality, humanity had already done so once before. It simply no longer remembered. The same pattern unfolded throughout the galaxy. On saying Helos, the Sangeli slowly developed their own civilization. Over countless generations, they established cultures centered around honor, military service, and personal achievement. Their history became defined by warrior traditions that would eventually shape one of the most formidable species in the galaxy. Unlike humanity, the Sangheili developed amid the ruins of extensive Forerunner influence. Relics and ancient structures occasionally appeared throughout their territory. Most were poorly understood. Some became sacred. Others became objects of study or conflict. Regardless of how they were viewed, these relics ensured that the Forerunners never disappeared completely from Sangheili history. Far away, another civilization followed a different path. The San Shayum survived the array just as humanity and the Sangheili had. Like everyone else, they rebuilt from primitive beginnings. Yet the San Shayum possessed characteristics that would profoundly influence the future. They were curious, ambitious, and deeply interested in knowledge. This curiosity eventually led them toward ancient Forerunner technology. The consequences would reshape the galaxy. Unlike the Sangheili, who often approach relics through the lens of honor and tradition, the San Shayum became fascinated by what these artifacts represented. They studied them, they experimented with them, and they sought to understand them. In many ways, they resembled archaeologists standing among the ruins of a lost world. Unfortunately, knowledge and wisdom are not always the same thing. The San Shayum learned much about Forerunner technology. They learned far less about Forerunner history. This distinction would become critically important later. As centuries turned into millennia, more species emerged across the stars. Some developed slowly, others advanced rapidly. Most remained unaware of one another. The galaxy had become fragmented. No Ecumene united it. No great empire connected distant civilizations. Space itself acted as a barrier separating cultures that would not meet for thousands of years. During this period, the Forerunners became legends, then myths, then gods. The process occurred gradually. A farmer living 10,000 years after the firing of the array had no way of understanding who built the structures hidden beyond this world's horizon. A tribal leader discovering an ancient relic lacked the context necessary to interpret its purpose. Over generations, facts became stories. Stories became traditions. Traditions became religions. The forerunners themselves had never intended this outcome, yet it was perhaps inevitable. Their works remained everywhere. Their explanations remained nowhere. Among the greatest examples of this phenomenon were the halo rings themselves. The installations continued functioning exactly as designed. Automated systems performed maintenance. Monitors carried out the responsibilities assigned 100,000 years earlier. Flood containment facilities remained active. Ancient protocols continued operating long after their creators had departed. The rings waited, silent, patient. Most of the galaxy had no idea they existed. Those that did rarely understood their true purpose. To later civilizations, halo installations appeared miraculous. Their scale alone defied explanation. Entire ecosystems existed upon artificial surfaces. Vast structures stretched across impossible distances. Advanced technologies remained operational despite the passage of ages. Few realized they were standing upon the most destructive weapons ever created. Elsewhere, other remnants endured. Shield worlds remained hidden. The Ark continued functioning beyond the galaxy. Forerunner archives preserved fragments of ancient knowledge. And deep within secure containment facilities, the Flood remained imprisoned. The parasite had not been destroyed. This point cannot be emphasized enough. The halo ray killed the Flood's food source. It did not eliminate every Flood form. Samples remained throughout the galaxy, stored, contained, studied. The Forerunners believed their safeguards would endure indefinitely. Many did, some did not. The danger slept. For now, that was enough. As the ages passed, new civilizations eventually reached the stars. They explored neighboring systems. They discovered relics left behind by their predecessors. They encouraged mysteries they could not explain. Each discovery brought them closer to truths buried beneath 100,000 years of forgotten history. Most did not realize they were retracing ancient paths. Humanity would eventually rediscover interstellar travel. The Sangheili would expand beyond their homeworld. The Sanshayum would uncover secrets capable of changing the fate of the galaxy. And somewhere in the future, those paths would converge. When they did, the long sleep that followed the halo array would finally end. The galaxy was about to awaken, and with that awakening would come the rise of the Covenant. Chapter 22. The Covenant was built upon a lie. Not a deliberate lie at first, not a conspiracy carefully crafted by ambitious leaders. The lie began the same way many of history's greatest mistakes begin, with incomplete understanding. For nearly 100,000 years, the galaxy existed in the shadow of the Forerunners. Their structures remained scattered across countless worlds. Their technologies continued functioning long after their creators had departed. Entire civilizations encountered artifacts so advanced that they seemed supernatural. Species that had never met the Forerunners, nevertheless, lived among the remnants of their civilization. Eventually, many reached the same conclusion. The Forerunners must have been gods. The idea was understandable. Imagine discovering a machine that had operated flawlessly for 100,000 years. Imagine finding a structure larger than entire cities that no one alive could explain. Imagine standing upon a halo ring without understanding its purpose. Most civilizations would struggle to interpret such discoveries rationally. The Sanshayum were no exception. Long before the Covenant existed, the Sanshayum had become fascinated by Forerunner relics. They studied them extensively. Entire fields of scholarship developed around the understanding the mysterious civilization that had vanished from history. Their curiosity produced impressive technological advances. It also produced a growing sense of religious reverence. The Forerunners were no longer viewed as a civilization. They became something greater, something sacred. Over time, This belief evolved into a central pillar of Sanshayum culture. Ancient structures became holy sites. Artifacts became relics. The disappearance of the Forerunners became a mystery demanding explanation. The explanation they eventually adopted would change the galaxy. According to emerging Sanshayum doctrine, the Forerunners had not died. They had transcended. The evidence seemed convincing. The Forerunners had possessed extraordinary technology. Their civilization had vanished. Therefore, many reasoned they must have ascended to a higher state of existence. This event became known as the Great Journey. The theory contained a tragic irony. The Forerunners had indeed disappeared, but not because they had ascended. They had sacrificed themselves to stop the flood. The distinction would eventually cost billions of lives. At first, however, these beliefs remained largely confined to Sanshayum society. The species was not yet a galactic power. Its influence remained limited. The future covenant did not exist. The Great Journey was merely a religious concept growing within a civilization fascinated by ancient mysteries. Everything changed when the Sanshayum encountered the Sangheili. The meeting should have been one of the greatest moments in galactic history. Two advanced civilizations reaching the stars. Two species standing on the threshold of a new age. An opportunity for cooperation, exchange, and mutual growth. Instead, it nearly became a catastrophe. The Sangheili had developed along a very different cultural line. Honor, discipline, and martial excellence occupied central positions within their society. They respected strength. They respected tradition. They respected achievement earned through action rather than philosophy. Most importantly, they viewed Forerunner relics differently than the Sanshayum. The Sangheili respected them. The Sanshayum worshipped them. This distinction created immediate tension. When disputes emerged regarding the proper treatment of Forerunner artifacts, both sides viewed compromise as unacceptable. The Sanshayum believed the relics were sacred. The Sangheili believed no species had the right to dictate how they should be used. Diplomatic disagreements became military confrontations. Military confrontations became war. The conflict that followed would later become known as the War of Beginnings. Despite the name, it was not a small conflict. Both civilizations possessed advanced technology and substantial military capabilities. Fleets clashed across multiple systems. Worlds changed hands. Casualties mounted rapidly. Each side believed itself justified. Each side expected victory. The war might have continued for generations had circumstances remained unchanged. Then both civilizations discovered something extraordinary. Forerunner technology responded differently to each species. The exact details remained complex, but the broader implications were impossible to ignore. Certain Forerunner systems recognized the presence of both species. Ancient technologies activated. Hidden capabilities emerged. Artifacts that had remained dormant for centuries suddenly became accessible. The discovery stunned both sides. Neither civilization fully understood what it meant, yet both recognized its importance. For the Sanshayum, it appeared to validate their religious beliefs. For the Sangheili, it suggested that continued conflict might destroy opportunities too valuable to ignore. Political leaders on both sides gradually reached the same conclusion. War was no longer the logical path forward. Negotiations began. The resulting agreement would become one of the most significant political arrangements in galactic history. The Sangheili would provide military strength. The Sanshayum would provide religious leadership. Together, they would pursue the Great Journey. The Covenant was born. From the beginning, it was more than an alliance. It was a fusion of religion, politics, and military power unlike anything the galaxy had seen since the fall of the Ecumene. The Covenant did not merely govern territory. It offered purpose. It offered meaning. It offered a vision of the future rooted in sacred destiny. Millions embraced it, then billions, then trillions. As centuries passed, the Covenant expanded steadily. New species were encountered. Some joined willingly, others resisted. Those that resisted usually discovered the same reality. The Covenant was extraordinarily powerful. The Sangheili formed the backbone of its military forces. Their fleets expanded. Their warrior traditions became central to Covenant culture. Meanwhile, the San Shayun refined the religious doctrine, binding the empire together. At the center of everything remained the Great Journey. The belief that the Forerunners had transcended. The belief that others could follow. The belief that the Halo installations represented sacred instruments of salvation. No one understood the truth. The irony was almost unbearable. The Covenant worshipped the very weapons that had extinguished the Forerunners. They sought transcendence through devices built for extermination. Every generation moved further from historical reality. Every generation became certain of its faith. Yet hidden beneath the surface of Covenant society were contradictions waiting to emerge. The Forerunners had not ascended. The Great Journey had never occurred. And somewhere in the future, a discovery would force Covenant leadership to confront a truth so devastating that it threatened the foundation of their entire civilization. That discovery would come in the form of humanity. The species the Precursors had once chosen. The species the librarian had prepared. The species that should not have existed according to Covenant doctrine. The collision between those two histories was approaching. When it arrived, it would ignite the greatest war of the modern age. Chapter 23. While the Covenant expanded across the stars, humanity remained unaware that it was not alone. This fact often surprises people when they first study Halo's timeline. Looking backward from the events of the games, it is easy to imagine that humanity and the Covenant were always destined to meet. The galaxy seems smaller in hindsight. The eventual war appears inevitable. In reality, both civilizations spent thousands of years developing independently. Neither knew the other existed. Both inherited fragments of a forgotten past. And both were being shaped by decisions made 100,000 years earlier. Humanity's return to the stars occurred gradually. Unlike ancient humanity, which had once ruled a vast interstellar civilization, modern humanity began from nothing. The survivors reseated upon Earth had no memory of the Ecumene. They possessed no knowledge of the Flood, the Forerunners, or the Halo Array. Their ancestors had once fought amongst the greatest powers in galactic history. Their descendants spent millennia rediscovering agriculture, mathematics, metallurgy, and eventually industry. History repeated itself. Civilizations rose and fell. Empires emerged and collapsed. Humanity struggled, adapted, and endured. The librarian had intended exactly this. Her goal was not to restore ancient humanity. The old civilization was gone. Its failures and triumphs belonged to another age. Instead, she had given humanity something far more valuable, a second chance. For tens of thousands of years, that second chance unfolded entirely on Earth. Then came the stars. The development of faster-than-light travel transformed humanity once again. Distances that had once been impossible became manageable. Exploration accelerated. New colonies appeared beyond the Sol system. Population growth expanded rapidly. Entire worlds were settled by people seeking opportunity, independence, or simply a fresh beginning. The pattern should sound familiar. It echoed the rise of ancient humanity. Not perfectly. History never repeats itself that cleanly. Yet the similarities were impossible to ignore. Humanity once again became a species defined by exploration. Colonies appeared throughout nearby systems. Trade routes connected distant worlds. New cultures emerged beyond Earth. By the 26th century, humanity had become a significant interstellar civilization. Not an empire on the scale of ancient humanity, not a power capable of rivaling the Forerunners, but substantial enough to shape its region of space. At the center of this expansion stood the Unified Earth Government, commonly known as the UEG. Alongside it operated the United Nations Space Command, or UNSC. Together they provided political and military frameworks supporting humanity's growing collection of colonies. To many citizens, the future appeared bright. New worlds offered opportunities unavailable on Earth. Scientific discoveries accelerated. Economic growth flourished. Humanity seemed poised to enjoy centuries of prosperity. Unfortunately, prosperity often creates new problems. As colonies matured, tensions emerged between Earth and the outer systems. Many settlers felt distant governments failed to understand their needs. Resources flowed inward, regulations multiplied, political frustrations accumulated. The result was the insurrection. The insurrection is often overshadowed by the Human Covenant War, but it played a crucial role in shaping modern Halo history. Long before the Covenant appeared, humanity was already struggling with internal conflict. Colonial rebellions spread throughout portions of human space. Terrorist attacks occurred. Military responses escalated. Entire regions experienced growing instability. The UNSC found itself confronting troubling possibilities. Humanity might destroy itself. This concern became especially significant because of one woman, Dr. Catherine Halsey. Few individuals have influenced Halo's history more profoundly. Her impact extends far beyond any single war or technological achievement. In many ways, she stands alongside figures like the librarian, the didact, and Forthencho as one of the defining architects of humanity's future. Halsey possessed an extraordinary intellect. Even by the standards of Halo's most brilliant characters, she was exceptional. Her work in artificial intelligence, military science, genetics, and engineering reshaped entire fields. Yet her legacy remains controversial because many of her greatest achievements emerged from deeply troubling decisions. Faced with the growing threat of the insurrection, Halsey proposed a radical solution, the Spartan II program. To later generations, the Spartans would become symbols of heroism. Their armor, training, and battlefield accomplishments would enter legend. Yet the origins of the program remain uncomfortable. Children were selected, taken from their families, replaced with flash-cloned copies designed to conceal their disappearance, and subjected to years of military training and biological augmentation. The process was brutal. Some candidates died. Others suffered permanent injuries. Those who survived became something unprecedented. Not machines, not ordinary soldiers, something in between. Among them was a child named John. History would remember him differently, the Master Chief. At the time, however, he was simply one candidate among many. He had no way of knowing the role he would eventually play. Neither did Halsey. The Spartan program existed to solve humanity's internal conflicts, not to defend against alien invasion. The irony would become apparent soon enough. While humanity prepared for civil unrest, events elsewhere in the galaxy were moving toward a different crisis. The Covenant had continued expanding. New species joined its ranks. Fleets grew larger. Religious doctrine became increasingly entrenched. Entire generations lived and died, believing the Great Journey represented the ultimate destiny of all intelligent life. At the center of this belief stood the prophets. The modern descendants of the ancient San Shayun had transformed themselves into religious and political leaders. They interpreted Forerunner relics. They guided Covenant doctrine. Most importantly, they controlled information. This authority gave them immense power. It also placed them in a dangerous position, because hidden within Covenant archives were discoveries that threatened everything they believed. For centuries, the Covenant had interpreted Forerunner technology through a religious lens. Relics were sacred. Installations were holy sites. The Forerunners themselves were divine figures who had transcended physical existence through the Great Journey. Then the truth began emerging. Not the whole truth, only fragments. But fragments were enough. Some Forerunner systems recognized humans in unusual ways. Certain ancient technologies responded to humanity differently than expected. Artifacts occasionally identified humans using classifications that should have been impossible according to Covenant doctrine. The implications were alarming. The Forerunners had not ascended, or if they had, humanity somehow occupied a place within that legacy. The details remained unclear, but one conclusion became increasingly difficult for Covenant leadership to ignore. Humanity represented a threat. Not a military threat, not yet. A theological threat. And theological threats are often the most dangerous of all. The prophets faced an impossible dilemma. If humanity's connection to the Forerunners became widely known, the foundations of Covenant society might collapse. Entire religious doctrines could be called into question. Centuries of belief might unravel. For an empire built upon faith, such a revelation was catastrophic. The solution they eventually chose would condemn billions. But that decision had not yet been made. For now, humanity continued expanding. The Covenant continued growing. Neither civilization understood how closely their destinies were linked. One inherited the legacy of the librarian, the other inherited the mythology of the Forerunners. Soon they would meet, and when they did, the collision would ignite a war unlike anything the modern galaxy had ever seen. Chapter 24. The Human Covenant War began long before the first shot was ever fired. It began with fear. Not humanity's fear, but the Covenant's. For centuries, the Covenant had expanded across the galaxy under a single unifying belief. The Forerunners were divine beings who had transcended physical existence through the Great Journey. Their relics were sacred, their achievements were holy. Their disappearance was not a tragedy, but a triumph. One day, the faithful would follow the same path and join them. This belief was more than religion. It was government, it was culture, and it was law. Every institution within the Covenant ultimately rested upon that foundation. If the foundation failed, everything failed. Most citizens never questioned it. Why would they? The evidence seemed overwhelming. Ancient structures covered the galaxy. Forerunner technology performed miracles beyond the understanding of normal people. The prophet spoke with authority derived from centuries of tradition. The Covenant appeared strong, unified, and destined for greatness. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. The source of those cracks lay within ancient Forerunner systems. As Covenant researchers continued studying relics recovered throughout their expanding territory, unusual inconsistencies appeared. Certain systems responded unexpectedly. Ancient databases contained classifications that defied acceptable doctrine. Automated technologies occasionally produced results that Covenant scholars struggled to explain. The discoveries were troubling enough that they attracted the attention of the highest levels of Covenant leadership. Among those leaders were individuals who would eventually become known as the High Prophets of Truth, Mercy, and Regret, the future rulers of the Covenant, the future architects of humanity's near extinction. The exact details surrounding those discoveries are scattered throughout various Halo sources, but the broader picture is clear. At some point, Forerunner systems revealed information regarding humanity's relationship to the Forerunners. The revelation struck at the very heart of Covenant belief. Humanity was not an accident. Humanity was not irrelevant. Humanity occupied a special place within Forerunner systems. A place that should not have existed according to Covenant doctrine. The implications were devastating. If humanity possessed a unique connection to the Forerunners, then the entire narrative of the Great Journey became suspect. Questions would follow. Questions would become doubts. Doubts would become investigations. Investigations could eventually expose truths that the Covenant's leadership could not afford to reveal. The danger was not military. Humanity's military capabilities were insignificant compared to those of the Covenant. The danger was ideological. A single truth can destroy an empire more effectively than 1,000 fleets. The prophets understood this. Faced with the possibility that humanity's existence might unravel the foundations of Covenant society, they made a decision that would shape the next 3 decades of galactic history. Humanity had to disappear. Not conquered, not converted, erased. The official justification would be religious. Humanity would be declared an affront to the Covenant, a species standing in opposition to the will of the gods. Their destruction would be presented as a sacred obligation. The real reason remained hidden. Humanity's survival threatened the Covenant's greatest lie. This decision transformed what might have been a diplomatic encounter into a war of extermination. Humanity, meanwhile, knew none of this. Across the outer colonies, life continued normally. Merchant vessels traveled established routes. Colonists built homes and businesses. Military planners remained focused on the insurrection. The Spartans were deployed primarily against human rebels. Political leaders debated familiar issues. Few imagined that an alien empire spanning thousands of worlds was already discussing their extinction. The first contact came at harvest. The colony world of Harvest occupied a relatively remote position within human space. It was prosperous, agricultural, and largely unremarkable by the standards of the UEG. Few people living there could have imagined their world would become one of the most important locations in human history. Yet history often begins in ordinary places. In 2525, Covenant forces arrive in the system. What followed shattered every assumption humanity held about its place in the galaxy. The Covenant's first encounter with humanity did not resemble diplomacy. There were no negotiations, no attempts at peaceful communication, no exchange of ideas between civilizations meeting for the first time. Instead, there was destruction. The Covenant attacked. Human settlements were annihilated. Orbital infrastructure was destroyed. Entire regions of the colony vanished beneath plasma bombardment. The scale of devastation exceeded anything humanity had experienced in modern history. The survivors struggled to understand what was happening. Who were these aliens? Why were they attacking? What had humanity done? The answers remained hidden within the highest levels of Covenant leadership. For the people of Harvest, there was only terror. Reports reaching Earth initially seemed impossible. Humanity had spent centuries alone. The existence of intelligent extraterrestrial life represented one of the most significant discoveries in history. The possibility that such life had immediately launched a genocidal war seemed almost absurd. Then more evidence arrived. Then more attacks, then more dead. The truth became impossible to ignore. Humanity was not alone, and humanity was at war. The UNSC responded as rapidly as possible. Fleets were dispatched. Military commanders attempted to assess the threat. Politicians searched desperately for opportunities to establish communication. Surely there had to be a misunderstanding. Surely some diplomatic solution existed. But there was no misunderstanding. The Covenant knew exactly what it was doing. The first major naval engagements demonstrated the terrifying imbalance between the two civilizations. Covenant warships possessed technological advantages humanity struggled to comprehend. Their energy shielding rendered many conventional weapons ineffective. Their plasma armaments could devastate human vessels in moments. Entire fleets discovered that tactics developed over centuries would no longer work. The war's opening battles were catastrophes. Yet something unexpected occurred. Humanity refused to surrender. The Covenant had expected another species to break beneath overwhelming force. Instead, they encountered an enemy willing to endure extraordinary losses. Human ships fought battles they could not win. Colonies resisted despite impossible odds. Military personnel adapted rapidly to unfamiliar threats. The Covenant remained stronger, but humanity proved tougher than expected. As news spread across human space, the conflict transformed society almost overnight. The insurrection had become secondary. Resources were redirected toward military production. Recruitment surged. Entire industries reorganized around wartime demands. Humanity entered a struggle for survival. Most believed it would be difficult, yet few understood how desperate it would become. Because the Covenant possessed advantages extending far beyond technology, their empires spanned vast regions of the galaxy. Their fleets numbered in the thousands. Their species had already fought together for centuries. Most importantly, they viewed the conflict not as territorial dispute, but as a holy war. And holy wars rarely end through compromise. The age of first contact was over. The age of extinction had begun. Humanity had finally met the heirs of the Forerunners. Neither side understood that both civilizations were marching toward the same destination, Halo itself. Chapter 25. From the beginning, humanity was losing. This is one of the most important truths to understand about the Human Covenant War. Later stories, particularly those involving Master Chief, can sometimes create the impression that humanity stood a reasonable chance of victory. The reality was far darker. For most of the conflict, there was no realistic path to winning. There was only survival. The Covenant possessed advantages in nearly every category that mattered. Their empire controlled enormous territories. Their fleets dwarfed those of the UNSC. Their technology surpassed human capabilities by generations. Even individual Covenant warships often outmatched multiple human vessels. Most alarming of all was the Covenant's ability to locate and destroy colonies faster than humanity could replace them. Every new world represented years of development, infrastructure, and population growth. Every world lost represented a wound humanity could not easily heal. The war became a slow retreat across the stars. One colony after another vanished. Some fought bravely. Some barely had time to understand what was happening. Many disappeared so completely that later generations would know them only through the casualty reports and memorials. Humanity quickly learned one of the most terrifying realities of Covenant warfare. The Covenant did not conquer planets. They glassed them. The term originated from the aftermath left behind by Covenant plasma bombardment. Entire surfaces were transformed into scorched wastelands. Cities vanished. Oceans boiled. Ecosystems collapsed. From orbit, many worlds appeared as though their surfaces had been covered by darkened glass. The Covenant was not seeking territory. It was seeking extinction. This distinction changed everything. Throughout human history, wars typically ended through negotiation, exhaustion, or political compromise. Humanity had no framework for a conflict in which the enemy's objective was the complete destruction of the species. How do you negotiate with someone who believes your existence is a sin? The answer, humanity discovered, is that you don't. You fight. The UNSC adapted as quickly as possible. New ship designs entered production. Military doctrine evolved. Research programs expanded. Every available resource was redirected toward the war effort. Yet adaptation could only accomplish so much. Again and again, human fleets found themselves confronting impossible odds. Naval engagements often followed familiar patterns. Human commanders would devise clever strategies. Their crews would fight with extraordinary courage. They would inflict casualties far beyond expectations, and they would lose anyway. The numbers simply favored the Covenant. Many historians compare the war to a boxer fighting a giant. Skill matters, determination matters, intelligence matters. But when the disparity becomes large enough, those advantages can only delay the inevitable. For much of the war, humanity's greatest victories were measured in time. Not territory, not conquest, but time. A fleet might sacrifice itself to allow civilians to escape. A colony might hold out for several extra weeks. A defensive line might survive long enough for reinforcements to arrive. These became meaningful achievements because survival itself had become meaningful. Yet amid the darkness, stories emerged. Stories of individuals capable of accomplishing the impossible. Stories of Spartans. By the time the Covenant War began, the Spartan II program had already produced some of the most capable soldiers in human history. The augmentations performed upon them enhanced strength, speed, reflexes, and endurance beyond normal human limits. Their training began in childhood and continued for years. Their equipment represented the most advanced military technology available to humanity. They were extraordinary. The war transformed them into legends. Spartan teams were deployed wherever the situation appeared hopeless. Boarding actions, assassination missions, reconnaissance operations, defensive actions against overwhelming odds. Again and again, Spartans accomplished objectives that should have been impossible. The effect on morale was enormous. For civilians, Spartans became symbols of hope. For soldiers, they became proof that victory was still possible. For the Covenant, they became something far more dangerous, an irritation, then a threat, then a nightmare. Among them, one Spartan gradually distinguished himself, John 117, Master Chief Petty Officer John 117, the Master Chief. At first, there was nothing particularly dramatic about his rise. He had always been one of the most capable members of the Spartan II program. His instructors recognized his leadership abilities early. Fellow Spartans trusted him. Commanders respected him. He consistently performed at the highest levels expected of a Spartan. Yet greatness often emerges through repetition rather than spectacle. Mission after mission, John succeeded. Operation after operation, he survived. As years passed, stories accumulated. The Master Chief became the soldier sent where survival seemed unlikely and success seemed impossible. Most people never met him. Many doubted some of the stories surrounding him. That hardly mattered. Humanity needed heroes, and the Master Chief became one. Meanwhile, the Covenant continued evolving as well. Although outsiders often viewed the Covenant as a unified empire, internal tensions existed beneath the surface. Different species occupied different positions within the hierarchy. Political rivalries emerged. Military leaders disagreed with religious authorities. Some Sangheili questioned decisions made by the prophets. Most of these disagreements remained hidden from humanity, for now. The Covenant still appeared monolithic and unstoppable. Its fleets continued advancing. Its crusade continued unabated. Yet the seeds of future fractures had already been planted. At the center of everything remained the prophets, truth, mercy, and regret. The hierarchs who guided covenant policy and religious doctrine. They understood the true reason humanity had been targeted. They understood the danger posed by ancient forerunner revelations. Most importantly, they understood that the war could never end through compromise. Every surviving human represented a threat to covenant orthodoxy. The logic was simple. If humanity survived, questions might survive. If questions survived, doubt might survive. And if doubt survived, the covenant itself might not. And so the war continued. Years became decades. Humanity lost colony after colony. Billions died. Entire generations knew nothing but conflict. The covenant expected eventual victory. Humanity expected eventual defeat. Yet neither side fully understood what was waiting for them in the future. Because while fleets battled across the stars, ancient forerunner systems continued operating in silence. Halo installations remained hidden. Monitors continued performing duties assigned 100,000 years earlier. The Ark remained beyond the galaxy, and somewhere among the countless relics scattered across known space, a discovery was approaching. A discovery that would change the war. A discovery that would reveal the truth behind the Forerunners, and a discovery that would place the fate of the galaxy into the hands of one Spartan. The road to Reach had begun, and beyond Reach waited Halo.